Uh, Good afternoon or good evening for those who are in Budapest, and good afternoon for those who are in the United States or elsewhere in the world. My name is Márton Gerő, and I teach at the Eötvös Loránd University Faculty of Social Sciences. And this is the first lecture of the lecture series, as Udita already said, Populism in History and Theory, which is, at least for us, is a unique possibility of cooperation with the New School for Social Research and from the New School Andrew Arato, who I will introduce in a moment, and from the ELTE, Antal Örkény and myself, the organizer of this lecture series. As Udita already said, the lecture series is part of a course jointly organized by the New School and the Faculty of Social Sciences at ELTE, but also an independent public lecture series about populism nowadays. The structure of the lecture today and the lecture series will be that first there will be speakers for about an hour, and then you will be able to ask questions, or we will be able to discuss topics and questions raised by the speakers. Today we will have, since this is the introductory part of the lecture series, we will have three speakers. First, Andrew Arato, who is the Dorothy Hart-Hirschen Professor in Political and Social Theory in the Sociology Department at the New School for Social Research, and probably most of you know them because of his interests and work in civil society, constitutional theory, and lately on his work on populism as well. The third speaker will be Antal Örkény, who is the full professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at ELTE, and probably most of you know him because of his work on minority studies and his work on public attitudes or attitudes about minorities in Central and Eastern Europe. And I will be the second speaker. So now I ask Andrew to give his first lecture about the definition of populism.
It's really a great pleasure for me to participate in this project, which amazingly enough, given my own Hungarian roots, I left Hungary at age 12, but been back many, many times after 1969 at least. It's kind of amazing with those Hungarian connections and so on, that this is the first time we've ever done this. It's a unique thing. And in spite of the fact that the New School claims to have many exchange programs with different universities all over the world. I, for example, helped to set one up at the University of Guadalajara in Mexico, as Carlos there, of course, will tell us. Nevertheless, not much is done around this. And well, I regret that. But in any case, one can accomplish things in action rather than in planning and theory. And we are doing this on that level. So it's great pleasure for me to do it, and especially because of the two Hungarian professors who are participating. Antal Örkény, I have known for a long time, and he's an old friend, and I've respected his work for a very long time. Márton Gerő is a new friend. Maybe we ran into each other before, but as far as my memory is concerned, really it's about a year or a little more than a year, 2-year friendship now. And I'm especially happy that he is part of this, because Antal and I are old timers, but one wants to see, of course, that critical and serious social studies are alive in Hungary and well. And in this course, we'll be able to demonstrate that, because many of you who are already here and some who are not will also participate. And I'm extremely happy and proud to do a US-Hungarian co-production. I'm a citizen of both countries, and I maintain my Hungarian patriotism even in these trying times. So it's wonderful for me to be able to do this, and I wish we could do other things at the New School with Guadalajara and with universities, other parts of the world. The fact that this is a Hungarian-American co-production, as we used to say when we were Marxists, is not an accident. It's not an accident, because these two countries have been very visibly part of the phenomenon that we're going to be discussing here. In this respect, the United States, at least in the very short term, shows the way forward, because an effort to establish a populist government, populism as the government, has failed in the short term, at least. In the Hungarian case, with the very partial exception of the local elections, including Budapest, one cannot yet speak of that electoral failure, but I think it remains, in my view at least, a potentiality. So in this respect too, the United States and Hungary are worth featuring in a course like this together. Antal will talk about Hungary today. Teda Skacspol will speak about the American case someplace later. And of course, the various Hungarian speakers will draw on their experience at home, as well as their comparative knowledge to address this course. So the way we organize this, and I think it's kind of amazing that we, the three of us, organized today's session so logically and coherently without being together in one room. The way we organize the session is that I will speak about the abstract matter of what the topic is, what the definitions of populism are. Márton or Marci will speak about the causal frames, the causal conditions under which this phenomena becomes salient. And then Antal will focus on the Hungarian case, which I think needs to be introduced, because though the Hungarian speakers know it to important extents, the rest of us, well, okay, I'm a little exceptional, but the rest of us from abroad know little about it, in spite of the fact that Orbán and Hungary are in the news, even in the international press, almost every week. And I already used up 5 minutes of my 20, and I'm going to watch the clock so we don't kill the discussion. So it will be 15 minutes, 5 minutes on definition, 5 minutes on the normative implications, and 5 minutes on the forms of appearance of the phenomenon. That's really the way it's supposed to work. So 5 minutes on definition. I think all of you who know this topic, and everybody here does, you know there's a huge battle around definitions, made even worse by the journalistic uses of the term. So in that sense, one has to try to be systematic. In my class on Wednesday, I've gone into the way that I solve the definitional question, the methodological tools I use derived from critical theory and from Max Weber. I won't talk about methodological matters, and so I'll be a little bit dogmatic about how I define the phenomenon. I do so in terms of 5 or 6 characteristics derived from the major theorist of populism, Ernesto Laclau, and 2 or 3 characteristics which are used to compensate what is missing from his framework. So first and foremost, populism involves an appeal, as you can tell from the term, to the people, but even more radically to popular sovereignty, which all populists feel is compromised by arrangements under almost all existing forms of contemporary politics, usually liberal democracies. But one of the places where populism emerges, namely Russia, the enemy was not yet liberal democracy for the Narodniki, but the still historically intact autocracy. But usually it's liberal democracy, and even in the French Revolution, which is the first important example of radical populism, I refer to Hannah Arendt's work on revolution, where this is said without actually using the term populism. Even in the French Revolution, it was a revolt against the Legislative Assembly and the Constitution of 1791, a liberal constitution of a certain type, that populism, the grassroots movement combined with the demagogic leadership of a Marat, eventually Robespierre, produced a kind of populist phenomenon. So the claim of popular sovereignty against existing representative institutions is a fundamental part of the phenomenon. But of course, popular sovereignty has to have a subject, and that subject, as you all, of course, can tell immediately, is the people, right? And obviously, democratic politics also refers to the people in a variety of ways. So referring to the people, already in the case of Marat and Robespierre, to whom I just referred to, involved a particular understanding of the people, as Hannah Arendt says, as a multitude, as a unified entity capable of action. That's surprising, right? Of course, because the actual people, the empirical people, Rousseau distinguished between the general will and the will of all. The empirical people are heterogeneity. It's not a unity. Society, contemporary societies are divided. So the second important feature is the intellectual forms of discourse which create unity from that multiplicity. Laclau calls this constructing a chain of equivalences. Others refer to it as a thin ideology. I would, without discussing this much, say that other movements, other parties, other politics too construct chains of equivalences, but populism does so in rhetorical and emotional, and today primarily in mass media terms. But what is the content? It has to have content, this thin ideology. One important addition one has to make to Laclau's theory is that, and this comes from Kasmode and Kaltwasser's work, there's a need also for ideological supplementation of some kind, a host ideology, as they call it. But this means that populism can exist already on the ideological level in a variety of forms, because the host can be socialism, as it is in left versions of populism. It can be nationalism, can even be racism. It can even be ethno-religious ideology, as in, I think, in the, well, not ethno, but religious national ideologies, as in the Indian case. So the construction of a visible ideology is supplemented by ideological hosts in almost every case. What is the content ultimately say that it is specifically generically populist? Well, the first dimension of it is that a part of the people is understood to actually act and be mobilized on behalf of the whole. Margaret Canavan, Laclau, many others stress this part-whole conception, and I think you can see how significant it is in almost every single case. The genuine people, the true people, the good people, the virtuous people, in one form or another, this appears in all populist discourse. But here the choice of host ideology makes a difference because for left populism, which chooses socialism as its host ideology, the people who can speak for the whole, or the party that can speak for the whole, is understood in terms of the subaltern. Laclau's word is the underdogs. But in any case, the poor, the excluded, the weak, Marx's 1843 text anticipates this way of speaking about it. Remember to think about the radical change and the radical exclusion that makes the proletariat be able to act on behalf of the whole. In the case of nationalism, it will be the ethnos, the ethnic group that will be so distinguished. In the case of the religious populisms that there are, and Iran, for example, has seen one along with India, it will be even a religious milieu that will be so distinguished. The content of who the part is will change, but the structure of part for whole remains and is definitional. Uniting even the part is difficult, though. This brings me to the third point, which is so important, because even if once you pick a part of the people as the true people, Marx ran into this problem with the proletariat, you again encounter heterogeneity, conflict. Remember Lenin's labor aristocracy, right? Why do you have to make up constructs like that? Or the weird term lumpen proletariat, which is so often present in some versions of Marxism, because there's heterogeneity also on this level. And this is even more the case for populism, which no longer analyzes its perspective in class terms. So how do you keep even this heterogeneity together? Very simply, populism, again, from Jean-Paul Marat on, always has to focus on some radical enemy with whom a life and death struggle occurs in society and is almost unavoidable in society. Again, who the enemy is will change according to the host ideology, but there will have to be some radical enemy. Carl Schmitt, who was in some respect a forefather of Chantal Mouffe and Laclau's version of populism, has even made friend-enemy relations the fundamental content of politics. And so then finally, what does this politics do or aim at? And in most versions of populism, the foundational dimension, the radical nature of this kind of politics is stressed. I would say, indeed, the idea of politics represents a secularization of the revolutionary, of the concept of revolution, which has become implausible in so many parts of the world. Remember the reform revolution debates within Marxism. Well, the political and politics, as in Carl Schmitt or even Hannah Arendt, represents a significant distinction which populism then jumps on, and in fact complements with a kind of disinterest in politics in the ordinary sense of compromise, of negotiation, of respecting opponents instead of making them enemies, and so on. Well, that's the definition. How many minutes have I used? I lost count of when I started. So I got to be careful here. And what I would like to suggest is that this set of concepts needs to be complemented in order to understand contemporary populism. For example, the way I just put it, populism would be, fascism would be a populism, and the distinction between fascism and populism could not be made. And certainly, in spite of the fact that so many writers on populism neglect this, one needs to add additional characteristics derived from empirical comparisons. I just mentioned two. I already said host ideologies as one, but there are two others beyond that. The electoral dimension, right? I already mentioned it in the United States, that turned out to be a weakness of populist consolidation. And then I should add the constitutional dimension. The electoral dimension, because in the age of mass democracies, which almost no one can escape, even the Soviet type societies, after all, had elections, right? In the age of mass democracy, you cannot simply abandon the electoral dimension. And this is especially true in the countries which had fascism previously. Elections become a mark of having emancipated Germany, Italy, some extent France, and so on, from the previous regime, which is totally discredited. But this happens also after 1989, I would say in our countries, but for the moment speaking as a Hungarian, in our countries, because elections become, I mean, you have them in Belarus, and Putin cannot do away with elections either. Now, to what extent these remain free and fair, as the saying goes, is another question, but at least the imagery of free and fair elections must be kept. So that's one addition to the set of ideal types I constructed. And there is another addition. This is the constitutional dimension. In Soviet-type societies, there are written constitutions. Who takes them seriously? Except in the moments of the transition, where they, of course, are used by oppositions in a certain way. But during classical Stalinism, yes, there is a constitution. There is even changed the constitutional amendments and so on. But they do not play, in my view, at least, a very serious role in political life. And under fascism, it's kind of amazing that Mussolini keeps the Risorgimento Statuto, which is an organization of constitutional monarchy, as the valid constitution of Italy, with a few minor consequences. So a new constitution is not made, and there's no reason to control its interpretation either. National Socialism in Germany even less constitutional, although even there the Weimar Constitution is maintained in a purely formal sense. Populisms turn to constitutional politics. We'll have a discussion in this lecture series about, is there such thing as populist constitutionalism? It's a highly debated topic for empirical reasons, and they have to do with the fact that in so many places, populists either make a new constitution, as it happened in the Hungarian case, or transform the courts in such a way that the existing constitution can be interpreted in diametrically new ways, opposed ways to how it was before. So adding electoral and constitutional dimension is what we need to define contemporary populism. So I would say that's about a half of what I needed to say. We could talk a little about ideal types, what happens when one of these characteristics is missing, what happens when one is stressed to the exclusion of most of the others, do you still have populism? And we could talk about matters of that type later. I'm more interested now in just dogmatically applying my own framework, which I want to do by very quickly, 2 minutes maybe, to indicate that though part of the democratic imaginary, as the stress on popular sovereignty demonstrates, populism in all its versions challenges democratic politics everywhere. And this is visible in terms of at least two of the characteristics I mentioned, part for whole and friend-enemy dimensions. The interpretation of popular sovereignty changes according to these two desideratas. I will just stress these two. Democracy cannot be the democracy in which a part speaks for the whole, and especially cannot be when the part is understood as a unified entity which has someone else to speak in its name, a leader or a leadership, usually a single leader, a characteristic I left out of my set of ideal types, the embodiment model of leadership I added now. That notion is incompatible with the notion of any democracy, including radical democracy of councils, which assumes heterogeneity and the importance of procedural devices to make some kind of temporary unity from the heterogeneity. So the idea of the people as one that can be embodied in the voice of a leader is cannot be made democratic. Yes, Carl Schmitt will argue, according to a concept of democracy that is actually no one else's, that identification, democratic identification is possible. And in that sense, a one-person dictatorship can be more democratic than a liberal democracy. That's a fairly outsider view, which we don't have to debate with. The other undemocratic dimension is the friend-enemy relationship, as you can tell. Because in a democratic setting, you have to treat those with whom you enter into political conflict as possible winners. That would have to be true in a council communist model too, in direct democracy too. There is conflict, and the conflict is resolved by majority decisions, or perhaps some complicated set of institutional devices which come into play, but they are resolved only temporarily. No one can speak in the name of the people permanently is a fundamental democratic premise. So the definition which I construct raises the question, at the very least, of the democratic credentials of populism. Although in the name of popular sovereignty, do populisms violate the fundamental norms of democracy, not empirically, but logically, or at least definitionally? That brings me to the forms of appearance of populism. And I will do this as the last third of my presentation, or maybe in 5 minutes or so. It's quite interesting. I was just reading for the other session of the class, Michael Kazan's Populist Persuasion in the United States, where he defines populism as the defense of the common people against elites. This is one of the minimal definitions which I think are misleading, because you could find many, many settings that do not resemble populisms in other ways, where the conflict of the common people against elites emerges. This is true even in Roman Republican politics, as those of you who know Roman history would know. And in almost every Greek city-state, that conflict exists, as Aristotle explains in the fifth book of the Politics. So then you would have no republic, really Republican organization in the general sense, without populism. And I think we need to be careful with such minimal definitions. But more serious about what Kazan does is he defines the term in referring to two forms of appearance, namely, or three, he calls them, but in my mind it's really two, namely movement, or movement, critique, and discourse. Now, if you're a US American, this is not a serious error, because populism has never formed, as Zsolt distinguishes, either part of a government or the government, and certainly no populist regime emerged. Trump has tried to become the government and failed, at least at the end of his tenure. Neglecting this dimension, if you're a Latin American, would be fatal, since in Latin American countries, populist governments have indeed emerged, and indeed sometimes constructed new regime types, as Maduro, I think, has temporarily, at least in the Venezuelan case. If you're Hungarian, this would be, of course, highly misleading too, this restriction to either movement or discourse, because though there were populist movements in Hungary, in my view, since 1989, and as Béla Greskovic shows, since the defeat of the first Fidesz government, the fact is that in Hungary, the grassroots part is less important, and the political party part is more important. Even the United States, populists formed a political party, after all, and this is not clearly understood in terms of the definition that Kazan proposes. So I would say populism, therefore, exists as critique, he's right about this, critique of existing forms, as movement, as following Zsolt Enyedi, I'm sorry, as party, and then following Zsolt Enyedi as in government, and as the government, and even the possibility of populist regimes or populist authoritarian regimes has to be admitted. 5 or 6 forms of appearance, and each one of them, I think, would have a different relationship to democracy, which I cannot discuss much now. Each one by the way, would open other opportunities to oppositions and to challenges. And so it's quite important to note which phase of populism, which form of appearance we encounter, and which is the one that we oppose. In the Hungarian case, and I end with this, in the Hungarian case, for example, if you look at what you have in Hungary, and I'm so happy to see so many Hungarian names among you here, if what you have in Hungary is a new authoritarian regime, as my very great friend János Kiss and János Kornai too maintain, then I think either the old Marxist answer, what you need is a revolution to overthrow it, or at least the 1989 answer that you need a color revolution or a self-limiting revolution to radically transform it. And as the voters of Budapest have shown, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. If Hungary or the Hungarian government of the present is not as vulnerable to electoral overthrow as was Trump's, nevertheless, I think it remains vulnerable. So understanding the phase of populism, the form of appearance at any given time, is fundamental, even if the definition that I proposed can be used for any of these phases. I stop, and I think what we said was that Gerő Marci will, or Márton Gerő, as we have it now in English, Márton Gerő will be the one who goes next.
Okay, thank you. I think the last part of Andrew's presentation showed that it's not only the existence of populism, populist political actors is interesting or are interesting, but the question how they, and especially from Hungary, Central and Eastern Europe, and maybe from the United States as well, that how these actors emerge and how they got into power and how they are able to maintain their power. And in this short presentation, I will talk about 15 minutes. I will focus on one aspect of this. What could be the moment when they are able to exploit the opportunities that they can grab the power, they can become as the most important political actors. In this attempt, I will try to explain how crisis might be an important aspect or concept in this. So first, and I think Antal will give more details on this. I have to call the attention to the fact that most of the studies on the emergence of populism and populist actors talking about the certain social conditions or structural conditions of populism. So they state that there are certain conditions among which populism is appearing or emerging in a society. Maybe the most important factors are the increasing polarization of worldviews and public opinion, the negative attitudes towards outgroups, usually minorities, immigrants, but more broadly towards the others in general, so the unknown, the hierarchical microstructures in a society and the supporting value sets, for example, materialism, traditional gender roles, fear from the future or risk avoidance, and the strong boundaries between social groups and large or at least stable inequalities in the society. However, these circumstances are often quite stable in a society. Like in Central and Eastern Europe, and especially in Hungary, they say that these conditions are historically embedded in the social structure. So you can find them in almost any stage of the modern Hungarian history. Or on the other hand, these conditions exist only partially. The studies applying or focusing on these aspects usually use the demand supply model. So they say that the social origins of populism are historically embedded in the society or in the social structure, and therefore there is a continuous demand for populist actors. That's why, for example, Kasman says that this is the reason that in most parliaments in Europe you find populist parties, because there is a continuous demand for them, or certain conditions in the value set or in the institutional settings which allows them to be there. The extent of this demand, of course, is changing, but and it's not stable maybe, but the demand is there. So these actors, then if we have this demand, these actors gradually exploit the possibilities provided by the social environment, the structural environment, and they then build a movement, create new identities, slowly transform the power in favor of themselves. And then when they grab the power and they become to the government, they might transform institutions, like we see this sometimes in Poland, but we certainly see it in Hungary. But still there is a puzzle. If there's, in these societies, the conditions are stable and existed for a long term, then why populism strengthens at a certain point? So which is the point and why is the point? This is the point when populism emerged, for example, in around 2008, 2010 in Hungary. And on the other hand, if conditions exist only partially, how these structural conditions are constructed or strengthened that populist political actors can increase their importance and power. So in one question, this would be the question that how political actors defeat these structural constraints or contingencies to emerge to power, or at least to increase their importance. And I think that crisis might be able to explain this moment. When we would like to define the concept of crisis, I think we have two paths, and I will abandon one of the paths, one of them. The first path would be a historical analysis, when we would like to identify whether there's a certain stage of history when a system or subsystem of a society collapses, and people feel or perceive this collapse as well. And this is also important, but I think when we talk about contemporary politics and the emergence of populist movements, maybe it's a better way to understand crisis as a perception of a potential threat which endanger the way of life of a community, so that most or majority of the people feel that there's a potential, there's a chance, a large chance that their life will be transformed radically in a relatively short term. Like the recent pandemic is a very good example, that most of us feel that that our life changed radically throughout or because of the pandemic. Usually also, crisis is also perceived as a transitional period towards something new, like the pandemic is also perceived as a transitional period. Usually when a crisis hit, we think that what is coming is usually worse than it was before, but it's not exclusionary. So some argue that what will come after the pandemic will be much better than before it, or in some sense it will be better. There will be at least opportunities. But either way, the perceptions of crisis and the discourses of crisis always includes threat and uncertainty, which might very possibly evoke fear against certain factors and against enemies, which then triggers regressive group mechanisms which are for example, the need for a strong leader who might be able to fight with these external forces or threats. The need for an increasing group coherence, which is switching off critical thinking towards the main discourses and the role of the leader in this group. And of course, it is for urgent and exceptional intervention, so urgent political action outside of the usual actions. So in 2 sentences, the crisis might strengthen the conditions favoring populism, hierarchies, the group boundaries, etc., and in the same time opens the space for political action independent from the structural conditions, at least from the institutional structures which we perceive. But there are different types of crises. Gerő and colleagues identified 3 types of crisis. In the sense, the crisis which is a perceived perception of threat and fear, uncertainty, etc. The first one is the exogenous shock. For example, a natural disaster or the pandemic or an economic crisis. Could be an 2008 economic crisis was for most of the countries. The second type is the endogenously generated crisis. So this is a crisis when the discourse and perception of the crisis is generated by insider actors, the political elite, for example. This is often probably framed by social scientists also as an elite engineered moral panics, when also people feel that the way of life is threatened. For example, the first phase of the refugee crisis in Hungary in the first half of 2015, there was an elite generated or endogenous generated shock, because there was no, or maybe a little bit the number of refugees increased, but it was not a shock for the institutional system. It was not visible for the people, but still political campaign appeared arguing or insisting that there is a potential threat of changing our life. And the third type is crisis redefined, which is an exogenous shock and in the same time endogenous crisis generation through reinterpretation. For example, the second part of the refugee crisis, because there was a large number of people arriving in the summer of 2015, but it was not, it wouldn't have been a long-term crisis unless the government insisted for years that it is an ongoing crisis threatening the way of life. The Hungarians then reinterpreted from a migrant crisis or the refugee crisis towards other types of from external actions. All of these types of crises involve some kind of uncertainty, but the second and third type involves uncertainty increased through agency, and probably the third type, the redefined crisis, involve uncertainty maintained by agency for a longer time. All of them involve, of course, urgent political actions, but at the first time, the exogenous shock, institutions should be defended through adjustment. So when an exogenous shock happens, first political actors might want to save the way of life by saving the institutions as they are. So they apply conventional crisis management. But in the second and third type, institutions are rebuilt or exchanged for new ones, or institutions are restructured by political action. So there's some kind of political innovation in that, questioning the conventional crisis management and insisting on new types, like the new types of regulation, allowing governments to apply different measures than from previously. And the main goal of the actor is different as well. When an exogenous shock happens, they have the main goal of immediately reduce the level of risk and contingency to overcome the exogenous shock. But when there's an endogenous generated crisis or a redefined crisis, the goal is to widen or increase the level of contingency, the level of room for political action, and uncertainty which might be managed by these actors. As such, the three types of crises might have different impact on populist actors, especially when they are in governments. For example, the exogenous shock might be, of course, these impact can be short term and long term. So, for example, the exogenous shock for governments or for political actors in government might strengthen their leadership on the short term, as these shocks increase the trust in governments in most cases, and then weakens. But since they need to run in these cases the institutions, which might not the best feature of populist governments, then on the long term it might weaken their leadership, because exogenous shocks cannot be fully managed by these governments. On the other hand, the endogenous generated and redefined crisis might strengthen leadership on the short term and on the long term as well. And furthermore, they might stabilize the social conditions favoring populism, strengthening group boundaries, hierarchical relationships, etc., etc., etc. So that's why I think this type of crisis perception, especially in the second two types of crisis, is important in understanding how populist actors might gain power. And of course, this is just a hypothesis which might be able to applied to certain countries and certain communities. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to Antal's presentation and then the discussion.
Thank you. And let me say first that I feel really honored to be in this group together with Arato and Márton Gerő. I think this is an exceptional project, especially in my experience and in the history of the social science faculty. And I really hope that both the seminar and the lecture series will be successful and can broaden the academic profile of our work. I have to emphasize that I am not an expert on this area, meaning that I did not have any significant research on this territory, except that I had some publications. So I would identify myself as an outsider in the topic, but maybe what I will tell you should interest you. The first question is what I wanted to raise, that why Hungary? Why Hungary, and what about the right-wing extremism during the period of the Orbán governance? Hungary is a small country, less than 10 million people who live there. It doesn't have a very important influence on global politics, but still in this topic, especially the Hungarian example can be very, very interesting. So what about the issue? Why Hungary, and what is the focus? The focus is that I want to talk about the Orbán government. The period of the Orbán government, which won the election in Hungary in 3 election circles, 2010, 2014, 2018. So more than a decade they are in governance. And not simply they won the election, but they have two-thirds majority of the parliamentary seats. There are a lot of definitions of certainty. What way we can describe the Orban period and the Orban government? There are a lot of effort and a lot of categories which appear in the academic discourse, like dictatorship, autocracy, competitive authoritarian system, plebiscite authoritarian regime, illiberal democracy, state capitalism, hybrid regime is very popular. I will reflect on this, that why it is not so easy to give a name of this whole system, and why there are so many discussions on this question. The political position of the Orban government has changed actually in the last more than 10 years, from conservatism to right-wing extremism, with forms of right-wing populism. It has a distinguished position actually in the group of these kind of political parties, namely that it has almost unlimited government position by direct electoral mandate. That's very important. So not simply, and this is, I would not necessarily simplify that it's a dictatorship, because it has almost unlimited government position, but it has a very strong electoral mandate, and that also have to be answered somehow for the researchers. When I'm analyzing the Orban government and the Orban period, I want to distinguish between two aspects of this kind of right-wing extreme political system. One is the power management and the political strategy. This is one direction how we can describe the Orban regime. Or the other one is an ideological or perspective, having a special ideology maybe, and what extent it has a symbolic, political, discursive characteristic. Let's start with the power management issue. The Orban regime, as I mentioned, it has changed a lot in the last 11 years, and this means that there is a kind of natural development of the system, which of course initiated by primarily the Prime Minister, and so when I list this special characteristic of this new system, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are fully completed. This is maybe under transition or just started to change. So this is why I think this is the reason why it's very difficult to exactly identify how we can call it, because we don't really see the end of this whole process. So what are the main characteristics? One, and I try to list them relatively quickly. The first, very important, is that one person of political leadership, a centralization of the power, which represented by Prime Minister Viktor Orban. It's a quasi one-party system. Formally, there are different parties, but by political influence or to the access to the political decisions, we can call it as a one-party system. Restrictions on democratic procedures, strong state concentration of the resources, that's very important, comparing to the previous periods when the market economy was just implemented into the new post-transition Hungarian economy. Market restrictions, crony capitalism, rent-seeking economic behavior and such. Political economic redistribution of the financial resources, and which is connected necessarily actually by the state corruption. The system is very deeply anti-liberal, and instead of the autonomy and freedom, the emphasis is on the state control. And then comes a lot of quite well-known characteristics like emptying the rule of law, weakening the division of power, suspension of checks and balances, the state control of the judiciary, severe distortion of the electoral system, and what's very important actually, this is the direct and indirect control of the media and the controlling access to the information in the country. So these are the pillars of the concept of Viktor Orbán, and this is the concept how he imagines the country which he wants to govern, and that's why I would call him as a founder, or as a person who wants to prove that he can create something, a creator inventing to implement a new regime in the country. The system or his effort has, of course, a lot of ideological expectations, which I think can raise the connection between the building of an authoritarian regime, as András Arato has mentioned, that maybe the most simplest definition is that it's an authoritarian regime, but it's also connected to very important ideological characteristics, which raise the question what extent they can be called as populist or extreme right populist governance. What belong to this ideological profile? First of all, the collectivism. They use the term we, the people, in Hungarian, magyar emberek, versus the individualism and also against elitism and social divisions. So this kind of collectivism is a very, very important part of their narrative. This directly leads us to the other very important characteristic, what we can call national supremacy, extreme nationalism, building a kind of exclusive collective identity. But this kind of extreme nationalism necessarily, of course, includes strong ethnocentrism, xenophobia, anti-refugee and anti-Semitism and anti-Roma, homophobia, male chauvinism, anti-homelessness, anti-disability, Islamophobia, and so forth, which very similar what we can call this concept, what we call group-focused enmity. The group-focused enmity is it means that internal and external minorities with different ethnic, cultural, and religious origin are blamed with jeopardizing the society, which is reflected by this kind of exclusion of this group and the anti-minority concepts, which actually is very close to reject all the differences in the society. Also, it's connected to the problem of authoritarianism, anti-pluralism, anti-liberalism, and the idea of the strong state and the strong leader, again, which already mentioned in the case of Orbán, the charismatic leadership. This is very, very important part of this ideological profile of the system. And what also was mentioned by András Arato, this creating enemies, finding scapegoats. This is a permanent tool of the system to find scapegoats. Just I want to mention, the refugees, or how do they call the migrants in general, or George Soros, for example, or the EU itself. So the scapegoating mechanism reminds to the populist narrative, which serves to to manage the power, and that's how it's a tool, the power management. Also was mentioned the moral panic. Márton Gerő's presentation, as I remember, he mentioned the moral panic. It's a very important factor to show the world and on the conflict and the fight of the good and the bad and moral division, what they create in the semantic of the social relationships, and this then it connected to the mediatization and very extensive propaganda, and what we can call a hate speech propaganda actually. And finally, the radical and militant way of speaking with a heroic rhetoric of the savior. That's also part of this ideological profile. So it's very rich profile, and in elements of this list what I mentioned, there are a lot of factors which reminds me to the populist narrative and the populist ideology. There's another side, of course, the Orbán regime, not simply the change of the system and to build a new power management, and also not to have, not to create a kind of ideological environment of their efforts, but also the social aspect of the whole question, meaning that there's a demand side. Why the Orbán system still popular? Why the Orbán system is broadly accepted in the society, and why the system could have 3 times in the last more than 10 years, always with a 2/3 majority. Actually, this 2/3 majority, it can be misleading because the electoral system has been dramatically manipulated, and the 2/3 is not a mathematical 2/3, but it's actually a political trick how they can have a 2/3 majority. So what is on the side of the social demand? On the social demand, we have to mention that there before 2010, following the transition in that decade, the social integration had a lot of disorders, and this the lack of well-working, stable social integration make a kind of prospect to Orbán's effort to create a change and create a system which is close to his mind and his interest. There was a political dissatisfaction, and still there is a political dissatisfaction and an alienation in the society. That's again made more easy to the Orbán regime to change the existing relatively stable previous democratic society. The attraction of losers and here comes the supporters who are supporting still, which is, as I told you, guarantee the victory of the party in the different elections. Traditional concept in the case of the extreme right, that the lower strata are more supportive toward this effort because their job insecurity. But here, what is interesting that in every social segment, you can find support toward the Orbán regime. One is the lower strata, of course, with the job insecurity and instability and frustration, but also the middle class feels that their position unsafe, feeling of deprivation, and is looking for a strong leader who can guarantee that even of the different economic problems and social conflicts, they can keep their middle class position. The higher subjective people with higher subjective well-being or with higher status, of course, they want to secure their position, and also they have a feelings of empowerment. So these are the classical sociological factors which helps the system to maintain their power. And there are a lot of socio-psychological drivers: welfare chauvinism, social dominance, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, authoritarianism, and political powerless. So these kind of cognitive factors, is even more influential than the classical so-called objective sociological drivers. These factors help to the mission, to the goal, to change everything and create a new world, a new society. And finally, this is my last slide. What's very interesting is I told you that the engine of the changing, the concept of change in Orban's mind is connected to crises. Crises are very important elements which help to create that system, and this crisis management is a kind of engine of power management and also the means of maintaining power concentration. And Márton Gerő has mentioned a lot about this crisis. I selected 3 major crises which played a very important role to help Orbán to complete successfully his plan. The first was the 2008 global financial collapse and the economic crisis and the social disintegration as a consequence of this crisis. And what happened, this was a starting point, because Orbán won the election after in the middle or the second part of this financial crisis, and this led to the 2/3 majority in the parliament, and that's led to the new constitution building the legal framework for the far right governance and to establish a concentration of political and economic power. So that was the starting point. 2015, there was the refugee crisis, a constituted threat and political hatred campaign. It was primarily created a virtual crisis because there was no direct threat by the refugees in 2015, but this crisis helped Orbán to create a fear of external threat, maintaining a state of emergency, enemy image and scapegoat construction, uniting people across class divides to achieve a so-called national purpose. Here comes the nationalism to heat up this whole nationalistic idea that which aims to defend the country against the enemies. And finally, 2020, the COVID-19 virus, the global pandemic crisis. This is the recent crisis, and we are hopefully getting out from this crisis. But this crisis helped to the crisis management that they can appear as the exclusive lifesavers, so they can play a role which can only hope the survival from the government. And of course, it meant that the state and the power concentration, the power concentration of the state was increased, full concentration of the resources as a state monopoly on everything in the vaccination and every problem. So this is again, these crises are continuously help the regime to not simply to stabilize their power, but even to increase their power. And I think it's very interesting, the whole problem of the crisis and how this kind of authoritarian type of extreme far right systems can be created and built up and invent and run and govern. My final comment is, I think that it was just 3 sentences. When I was listening, in this week we had a fantastic moment on Tuesday when the new American president was put in power, and there was the inauguration, and in his speech, which was a wonderful speech, he mentioned, which usually all the presidents say, by the way, that he wants to be the president all the Americans. It's a beautiful sentence. Nevertheless, Orban, if I come to, it's not fair to compare him to Orban, but if I compare to Orban, he also mentioned that he, let's say when he is criticized, that he's only the representative of the people of Hungary. He's the voice of the Hungarians, and they simply want to transfer the people's will when he's fighting, you know, for the special interest of the country. And I was thinking, what is the difference between the two sentences? And I think the first one is it's an inclusive concept of the nation and the society, where people are different, people are individuals, and the role of the president is to make a kind of unity in the society. While in Orban's speech, it's an exclusive concept. He used this whole term as people to prove that he is the representative of the Hungarians, and all the others who are not agree with him or who are criticizing him and such, they are not belonging to this community. And I think this is why the populism appears very directly in his public appearances. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the inspiring lecture, Antal, and thank you, Andrew, as well. So now the floor is for everyone. We have around 45 minutes for discussions, questions, remarks, criticism of what you your new ideas. So please, if you want to tell something or ask something, please raise your hand. If you open the participant list, there is an icon for raising hand. So raise your hand there and I will call your names, and then you will be able to unmute yourself. Okay, so please. Adam, yes.
Yes. Hi, hello. Hopefully this question is a bit easier. This is the small question for Professor Örkény. You briefly mentioned that there is a common rhetoric of the savior used in Hungary, and I was curious if you could speak to the way in which that understanding of a savior is secular or religious. Does it cross both boundaries? Does it play into a certain religious history within Hungary? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting, very important question. And it's connected, for example, that even in a more general way, how, for example, the religion plays a role in this new kind of ideological setup. I think the surveyor is more a kind of pragmatic, like in a film. Like in a film, what we watch, you know, when there's a hero, he will help to solve the problem. And the value aspect, the symbolic aspect of the behavior is not well done yet. So it's he's playing with the church. Of course, he cultivates, you know, the different ceremonies and such. But I don't see that the religion. Just I thought there was a PhD defense this week with a Turkish student wrote a very important comparison of the Hungarian and Turkish regime, and he spent a lot of time in his analysis to focus on the religion and the religious. And in Turkey, for example, the Islam, it plays a very, very important role in the legitimacy and the ideology of the system. In Hungary, it's not. You have to know that Hungary is a very secularized country, meaning that people believe on their own way, but they do not really connect it to churches. So he very carefully plays with this kind of religious component and more try to use it as a pragmatic resource. Of course, he emphasized that Hungary is just today, I think he again emphasized that Hungary is a Christian country and Hungarian culture is a Christian culture. But I don't think that it takes it seriously, because the voters do not sensitive to listen, this kind of arguments that religion is the foundation of the new system in Hungary. But he's playing with it. So this is more strategy. So this kind of severe problem is more a strategy problem and not a deep ideological concept.
If I could,
Okay,
I just want to make a very brief comment on the same subject. I mean, you have seen a very similar structure in the United States, because after all, if you look at now the last two presidents, the current one is a genuinely religious man, the second Catholic in U.S. history, and he's sincere about his religious beliefs. Left-wing social Catholicism more than authoritarian Catholicism. The previous one was clearly not religious, and indeed a moral personality offensive to almost every great world religion, and probably even to the religion of tribal peoples everywhere. And yet, tremendous support from the evangelical community, right? So in some way or another, now they have a theological way of explaining how this is possible, but nevertheless, it shows that the structure is a secular one, a secular identification, which then religious people with that kind of authoritarian personality fixations can follow and use, but the appeal itself is not religious. And so I want to support what Antal, we're on first name basis, where Antal has so well put for Orban, whom I know personally, and I know that the guy is not a religious person. Whether he believes or not, no one knows.
Yeah.
Okay. Summit, please. And then Agnes, I see you. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask Professor Arato something about the way he defines populism. I mean, I'm working on democracy, and so I mean, the way I see it is that the Eurocentric model of democracy, it works on the foundation of excluding the demos out of the sovereign power structure and accumulating power in the hands of a few, which is based on a sort of competition, free competition for power. And that competitiveness is basically formulated in the form of politics, in electoral politics. The idea is that in a democracy, there will always be a majority and there will always be a minority. And that I mean in terms of electoral majorities and minorities. Wherever democracy exists, majorities and minorities exist as well. Now, if that does exist, then populism basically is a byproduct of democratic evolution itself. It came with democracy. And if we look at the ideological content and the friend-enemy paradigm that you tried to describe, even in the case of United States, when Biden actually won the election, the idea was that Trump and his supporters were fascists and they were the enemy of the state. So the idea that Biden's presidency, in this sense, would you actually describe it as a populist movement as well, or in terms of how democracies work? Would that be in terms of mass democracies? Is it every single government that comes to power? Would that not be a populist government?
Yeah, I of course profoundly disagree with everything you said. Not just one part, but I don't agree with any of it. For example, the form of democracy established in the Western countries has, of course, an oligarchic dimension, aristocratic at best, but oligarchic at worst. But there are many, many other structures, local government, freedom of association and of movements, and so on, which indicate checks on this. Now, I'm an author of a book on civil society, a co-author, which argues this case on a normative level, but also with empirical illustration. So I, first of all, don't agree with how you describe Western democracy. By the way, how Eurocentric is this when the largest non-European country, the second largest, India, has adopted this particular framework? Is it a vestige of colonialism, you would say? Well, I think that Mr. Nehru and Congress were far more powerful than the colonialists by 1945, 46, 47. They created the system they wanted to create, and very different than the Westminster model, by the way. So Eurocentrism, no, sir. I don't accept that either. And then, of course, Biden. If you want to find a non-populist leader right now on the map, I completely agree with Antal. He is the one. Friend, enemy to him? God, everybody's going to criticize him for being too conciliatory, for too attempting to have dialogue and support and supporting discussions and interaction with the Republicans. Sure, there are people in the United States who think of the Republican Party and the insurgents of January 6th as the enemy. I must say that I am more tempted to think that than Biden is by far. But in Biden's case, nothing is further from his mind. And he will not follow in creating enemies, which is the important populist device. He is going to try to diminish animosity, to transform enemies into opponents. You see, your confusion is you think that conflict or opponent relations are the same as friend-enemy relations. They're not. Carl Schmitt understood the difference very well. So I think that in the United States right now, you have a presidency which for the moment sees itself as empowered to do things on behalf of the American population, but it's only for the moment, it's only temporary. It's very important to regard it as temporary. Did Trump regard it as temporary from the outset to questions whether he would in fact accept defeat in an election? He said, no, the only proof of a fair election is if we win. That's the populist idea. The Republican Party's view, at least 1/3 of it has this view that only fair election is the one that Republicans win. Why? Well, because if we lose, it's because the blacks and the Hispanics were allowed to vote. That's the reality. So I think that, and then majoritarianism finally, I think you might have heard of the idea of concurrent majorities. Anything that happens in the United States is achieved through a variety of majorities, not the majority.
Thank you. We can return to the discussion on this topic, I think, as well. So Agnes Kőér-Bontil is the next, and then Carlos Alvarez Marin. So Agnes, please.
Yes, thank you. I would address my question to all the speakers today. And it is, what do you think how populism relates to neoliberalism and the failure or the flaws or the deficiencies of neoliberalism and the social and economic polarization, which is one of the prerequisites of populism? And how would you explain this, and what do you think whether we can somehow change or move on transform or go beyond neoliberal economic regimes and world order, and then we can and actually what is also important, somehow the neoliberal polarization and the whole neoliberalism undermined democracy from certain perspectives. So I think these things link together, and I would like you to tell something about that and how we can go beyond this pretty heavy limitation what we have right now.
I don't know if Antal or Andrew, would you like to start? to answer.
I would rather have you start. I'd rather have you start because I so much agree with this question that it's not easy for me to really start the discussion. I would be actually interested in hearing what the two of you say.
Okay, first of all, I always have trouble when when someone mentions neoliberalism, that what this actually means. So, but if you mean economic structures which then through the how to say certain manipulation of living conditions and people frozen the social structures and then creates polarization in terms of living conditions or something like that, then I can agree with you in a way that I think one of the main aspects here is the multiple fractures in a society. So the political opinions, the different worldviews, which is, let's say, a constructivist process, then despite maybe the similar problems, similar living conditions in social groups, not these actual problems, access to resources, but worldviews define somehow how we see the problems around us. And politics plays a major role, not just through political communication, but forging somehow the economic structures to create these divides. So in this sense, I agree with that. Also, I think that that probably the different parts of the world, for example, Central and Eastern Europe, have different limitations in changing these structures because of the different, power relations in this system. So maybe Antal is the next, and then Andrew.
Your first sentence was very. It did influence me very strongly. That what does neoliberalism mean? As an economic theory or a political theory? As an economic theory, I don't see connection between populism and the neoliberal economic concept. So I don't know. I'm not an expert on this question. András?
Okay, well, as I already indicated my agreement, I should, of course, modify it, right, to some extent. Too much agreement is not great, and we have to have discussion. So, of course, populism historically, if you go back to the French Revolution, as I just did, but if you go back to Narodnichestvo or the American populists, even Peronism, right? Neoliberalism has not even been coined as a term, or maybe it existed in the mind of Hayek or some thinkers, but it was not a political project or an economic project until really the 1970s with the crises of the welfare states in Europe and Reaganism, Thatcherism, so on. The end of import substitution in Latin America is part of this also, roughly the same time. So neoliberalism is newer than populism, right? But of course, if you actually want to examine populism of different epochs, for this epoch, it must have some relevance, right? The idea that it does not is peculiar in the sense that so many countries which at least share some important dimensions of the policies of the Washington Consensus have either populist governments or at least strong populist movements. And I think in this sense, it's an empirical phenomena. The two are linked. Of course, we have to define each one of them properly and all the rest. I think that the most significant part of this question, I don't know if Agnes agrees with me on this, is not just neoliberalism, but what has been called as the bait and switch politics of social democracy and socialism, especially strong, I think, for those countries of Central Europe where older forms of socialism have been discredited and where the ability, the financial basis to create modern welfare states was not there from the point of view, from the start of the regime change. The fact that here, but this is not only true here, but also it's true for social democratic parties in Western Europe, indeed the Democratic Party in the United States and the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, for all these parties to have adopted one version, or at least one dimension, one part of a Washington consensus model, was not only led to the things you correctly mentioned: greater inequality, greater dependence on finance, and races to the bottom, one should say, among the countries, but also to the loss of representation by those whom social democracy previously represented. And it is in that space, and I said I know Orban, I know him personally. He's an extremely clever guy. He was a neoliberal for sure, right? A Thatcherite. He was a Thatcherite, more so than the Alliance of Free Democrats, the party that I supported, although it had some Thatcherite politicians too. And he has noticed that on that side, he has too many competitors. But on the side of representing the interest that social democracy previously has represented, there was no competitor in Hungary. He jumped into that space through this peculiar mixture of neoliberal, statist, corporatist, and I would say also corrupt political formulas. But still, that space was opened up by the bait and switch strategies of the socialist parties, and I would say the Free Democrats too, because initially the Free Democrats were a social liberal party. Not much remained of the social by the 1990s. So I would say that even in a causal sense, in the short-term causal sense, neoliberalism played a significant role. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I absolutely agree. Thank you.
So Carlos Alvarez Marin is the next.
Thank you, everyone. Just wanted to question, can populism can work within a federal system in the long term? I mean, the centralization that most populist regimes entail seems to run against federalism, both in administrative and political terms. I mean, in terms of the control of the budget and the control of political decisions, or it finally destroys it. I mean, populists in the long term tend to transform into an authoritarian regime, or there can be a mixture that maybe we haven't seen and we are about to see in the next years, mixture between populism and healthy federal system.
That's, I think, a question for me, because I live in a federal system, and indeed, I know his federal system too, having spent a lot of time in Guadalajara. And I think the question is also for you as a political person: is Jalisco going to resist your project of left-wing populism? Is it able to resist it? But of course, Mexican federalism is, I think, weaker than the American one. Now, in the United States, the project of Trump runs into the separation of powers, but at least through court packing and court appointments, he has overcome one part of that. And by neutralizing the role of the House of Representatives through the majority in the Senate, Congress did not play much of a role either. This became a problem in January because the Congress was going to help appoint his successor, and then Congress became a limit as well. But the biggest limit is federalism. Carlos is entirely right. I mean, can you accomplish what Orban accomplished in Hungary, which is a centralistic country now? Of course, it was part of a very bizarre dual imperial, quasi-imperial system at one point in history. But since the collapse of that in the First World War, it's been a highly centralized country. That made it easier for Orban to do what he did, right? And I think the nice question is for the Hungarian participants is the Gergely Karácsony administration in Budapest going to be able to do something which will at least represent an element of resistance to the centralizing authoritarian trend? I see skepticism on Antal's face already, but I think that if you ask the same question about New York State, which has 20 million plus, or California, which has 30 million plus people, it's a very serious question. Could you pull this off in the United States with Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, California, New Mexico now in opposition? No, you can't. The Trumpian project had to fail in one form or another, if not on the separation of powers, then on the level of the division of powers, namely federalism. So, Carlos, yes, the question is excellent, but you're going to have to answer it in Jalisco yourselves.
All right, then I think Barbara is the next. Barbara Horváth.
Yeah, thank you. So Mr. Örkény has mentioned that Fidesz or Orban supporters are in every segment of the society, and it's not characteristically lower class phenomenon to vote for Fidesz. And I'm a bit struggling with grasping the motives behind voting for Fidesz when we have to leave this class-based, I don't know, idea behind voting behaviors or so what do you think? What are the other factors, or how can we say something about this?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I mean, what I said was based on the research. So, but I can say that there are no special social specification whether someone is a supporter or not the Fidesz. I think the crucial point is the dependency, how much someone is dependent on the Fidesz and the Fidesz government and the state, what is, of course, run by the Fidesz. And this kind of dependency, exists on the lower strata, like the most deprived groups also, because it's also proved by a lot of surveys, not done by me, but some others, that the poor people, let's say from the public work system, but the Fidesz introduced in a very extensive way, connected the people to the government. The middle class, as I mentioned, they have a they feel themselves declining, and again they hope. So the Hungarian society, one is quite typical in a lot of surveys, which proved that people's expectation for their life problems to solve is going to the state, and this kind of, but it's connected to the dependency. So if I expect everything to solve by the state, then I cannot keep a distance, or this distance toward the state, and to keep my autonomy and individual self-responsibility is disappearing. So these surveys when we try to explain the social background of the voters, it seems that not the social position is the most determinant. If someone is, because not, of course not all the people vote for the Fidesz still, so we talk about maximum 3 million people from the 7,000-8,000 eligible voters, but the mentality, the cognitive factors, and this kind of cognitive mechanism, like the nationalism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia. So this kind of the moral panic, that's also a cognitive mechanism. So this mechanism tie most the voters and keep them fanatically believe that Orban is the only person who can guarantee their life and their future and their success. Your question is absolutely relevant, because why still there are many people who either don't vote for the Fidesz or they vote for other parties. That's again a very complicated story, because we have to talk about the opposition, the choices, how you can vote. So, but that group who are potential supporter of the Fidesz, more easy to identify, and primarily by cognitive factors.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any hands raised. Andrew.
I found your two presentations really excellent, I must say. And I think that I'm excited about doing this together, and it's really, really interesting. And I think you have made Hungary look interesting also to non-Hungarians, which is not that easy because it's such a small country, right? But you did it, and Mr. Orban helped, of course.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem.
You have to thank him. But...
Yes, but in 1989, other things, and that made Hungary interesting also for a significant period. So I really appreciated your interventions. But I want to return to an abstract question toward the end, which Örkény raised, and of course I touched on very briefly too, namely assuming that populism is relevant to Hungary, right? Which I think we all assume. Nevertheless, which form? And I think there's no question, if you go back to this Enya de Zsolt distinction, that Fidesz is the government. Populism is the government. It's not just in government, as Trump was, for example, or as coalition parties in Western Europe, for example, Five Star is in government, but it is not the government, right? And Austria was similarly at an earlier period. But in Hungary, it is the government. So that's the minimum we have to say. But I think what Antal said, supporting my very good friend János Kiss, and the man I admire, János Kornai, not a friend of mine, but I think he's responsible in some sense for the neoliberal aspect that we discussed. But still, he could be right about lots of things, and he's a great economist also, certainly. The two Jánoses think that Hungary is an autocracy. And of course, the question is not whether autocracy is dictatorship or not, but whether a threshold has been passed to the regime level. And in my view, not, because I am perpetually optimistic and I'm not living there. And the Americans have proven me right anyway, by getting rid of at least a weaker effort ultimately than what you have seen in Hungary, but still getting rid of it. And so I want to think that it is possible to electorally get rid of it. If it is impossible to electorally get rid of it, and you need a revolution or a quasi-revolution, then I think we step through the regime threshold. Has Hungary stepped through the regime threshold already, or is it uncertain? That's my question to the two of you.
Okay. Antal, please.
Okay. First of all, I want to be positive and say it's uncertain. So that's the minimum as living in Hungary, I can say, because otherwise, why do I stay here? So, and of course, it's very subjective response, because the problem is that this kind of transformation, what happened in Hungary in the last more than 10 years, it was very strongly affected the institutional setup of the system of integration and the governance and the political power. So it's not simply a question of an election, because I would say very easily the answer. I mean, the election is still free, even if the rules are not very equal. But it can happen that in an election, Fidesz fails. But what's happened next? This is the question. Because all the institutions are reshaped according to a requirement of an authoritarian regime. And there will be a non-authoritarian government trying to work together with an authoritarian built system. That's a big contradiction. And but I don't believe that the Fidesz period is forever. First of all, because it's a one-person system, so it's not very promising to me that sooner or later he's going to get retired, because he gets old. But it doesn't help me to manage my life and be optimistic. So right now there are a lot of speculations, and because the system was manipulated on that way that if the opposition wins relatively not a relatively big margin, then they can have also they can have a 2/3 majority, because the whole system is manipulated and unbalanced. So if the opposition wins, then it can be double. The success can be doubled in the parliament. And then what's happening? I don't see the opposition really prepared for it, because right now we have the first very important question is that what happens with the constitution?
Right.
That's a crucial question. And it still needs 2/3 majority, so the system was not changed. If it happens that opposition parties together can reach 2/3 majority, they can do it. But is there any constitution on the table? I don't see. So this is a kind of impotency by the opposition, because we would discuss even in opposition that what kind of constitution we would like to see as the rule of our life in the future. So this is my answer.
Wonderful. Brilliant, as always.
I will answer his question too, but first I would like to give the possibility to Adam Brown, because he has a last question, I think. So please.
Sure.
This is the last one, I think.
Yeah, I have two questions. Feel free to respond to either. They're coming from different perspectives. So first, concerning Professor Gerő's presentation and his connection of crisis with the pandemic, I was curious if we could understand crisis as being experienced universally at some moments, and I'm thinking of this as a very unifying understanding of universal. Can we redefine the exclusive definition of the people and make it somehow more inclusive? So this is like crises globally of global warming, crises on the country level, like massive forest fires in Brazil or Australia. Do those have the potential to do something to change the people to a really unifying entity? The second question, in a very different lens, is concerning Professor Örkény's note on exclusive collective identity. You noted the presence of anti-Semitism in Hungary, and this struck me as curious in combination with Professor Arato's note on the fear of abandoning elections post-World War II. Because it seems like if fascism has become iconic, so too has anti-Semitism post-Holocaust. So I guess I was curious as to why something like abandoning elections was able to become so fearful and such a terrifying thing to do, at least in terms of the image. Why has anti-Semitism not gained a similar sort of fearfulness? Why are we not duly afraid of being seen as anti-Semitic post-Holocaust?
Great questions, I think. Regarding the crisis, I think you can identify crisis on different levels, on the small community levels, from small community levels to maybe to country or regional level, European level, even, or maybe a global level if you take global warming. But the question is whether people perceive it as a crisis or not. This is maybe the problem with global warming, that you're not perceiving it as a crisis in terms of, how close it is or not, or how it is transforming our way of life. It can be unifying as well. I think usually exogenous shocks like an earthquake is unifying in many, on the short term at least. It depends on, I think, of course, the indigenous crisis always has, I think, at least in most cases, has the intention to dividing people, not to unifying them. But it can be still maybe unifying. A longer term crisis can be unifying depending on the circumstances. So how the institutional structure is in a country, what are the how embedded is the responsiveness for enemy images in a country. So who you're blaming. For example, you can blame for global warming, you can blame, or for immigration, you can blame George Soros, but you can say that this is the cause of global warming. And this will be very different in terms of action and in terms of framing the whole problem. So I think it depends on the circumstances, maybe, that it can be unifying or not. So you can maybe use crisis to unify people as well. But I would say when you try to use it, you are already in the path to dividing them. So this is some kind of problem of a paradox, maybe, but I don't know how to resolve. Okay, Antal, please.
Yes, I could hardly understood because the technique, your question, but the last point I understood. So if I only answer to the problem of the question of concerning to the anti-Semitism is okay for you, to you? So this is the main point, the anti-Semitism. Okay. As the time is almost over, I will tell you, because it's a very, very complicated story. Very complicated story because its history, its cognitive characteristic and such. Who knows who are the Jews? Blah 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 blah. But then I tell you a good example. In Hungary, there was a politician, a party leader actually, József Tordján, who was heading the Smallholders Party, which was a conservative party with a long history in Hungary. A lot of, by tradition, a lot of peasant origin or peasant people supported this part, but it was never in the power, in majority. They were in coalition with the first government. And once he was asked, he was a lawyer, and once he was asked why he never involved in any anti-Semitic discourse or political discourse, and he never showed any sign to be anti-Semitic. And you know what he said? He said, personally, I am not an anti-Semite, but this is not the reason, he said. The reason is that my supporters, let's say the lower peasantry, middle peasantry, the tradition and such, if I bring up the issue of the Jews, there will be a very complicated feeling in my voters, because they will feel ashamed, and their memory is starting to work, and they want to forget it, what happened in the Holocaust. So the best if I don't touch it. So a little bit similar is Orban's reaction to this whole question. I don't think that Orban personally an anti-Semite person, but he see that as a populist kind of leader, everything he is judging what extent it can stabilize or even increase the number of voters who can guarantee his power. So some issues which are dividing among the voters is not a good field. It's not a good field. So this is why I think the political anti-Semitism, I don't see that. Of course, there's a lot of discussion that the anti-refugee, anti-migrant campaign, they used a lot of symbols of the Nazi communication and such, and that's partly true. I don't want to deny, but directly they are trying to keep away themselves from this whole Jewish Holocaust issue. They never give up, to mention the refugees. Even now, that the virus crisis, they mention that the refugees or the migrants bring the virus and blah blah blah. So always they are not able to forget this kind of terrible discourse. And in the Roma, they also more ambivalent, but in the case of the Jews, they are very careful. They are very careful to touch it. So
just let me two sentences to this topic. So I think it's very complicated discourse in Hungary. First, you have this direct blame on the Roma and refugees, immigrants, but they also picture these groups, most of these groups, as powerless. So they are poor, they don't know what they are doing it because the instincts or something like that. So to play this scapegoat and enemy game perfectly, you need powerful enemies as well, who are the international elite, maybe, with the help of the human rights NGOs and stuff like that. And in this discourse, although they never mention the word Jewish, and even they divided somehow the Jewish institutional infrastructure into two, and they're using one of side of that to show that they are anti-Semitic, and they're supporting a lot of projects. The discourse in many cases is very similar to an anti-Semitic discourse. So they say liberal, and in Hungary, liberal has a very close, in this political discourse, has a very close relation to Jewish, to the word Jewish. So you might just change that so people might understand it that way. There's a debate on that. It's not obvious in many cases, but also you can somehow extract from the discourse. So it's on the subconscious level, it's there. On the direct level, they are very careful not to touch upon this topic in many cases, in most of the cases.
If I could address this too, I completely agree with the two colleagues. Hungary is not, the population is not very anti-Semitic compared perhaps even to Poland still and some other places. And so the Jewish question is not a big question as such in Hungary. But there was another aspect to Adam Brown's question, which is the taboos after the Second World War, which he felt should apply here as well as it has in the West. And I don't think that he took into consideration one important phenomenon, namely communism. That is, in communist countries, the kind of Bewältigung der Vergangenheit, the kind of overcoming the past, has not occurred in the same way. There is an anti-fascist ideology, but the idea of actually exploring the role of fascism in everyday life, in different strata of society, has not been explored. And in that sense, one can say that that the possibility of fascist, not necessarily anti-Semitic politics, later in some of these countries than it is in Western Europe. What's my proof? There is an obvious proof of this, namely Germany. Which part of Germany have neo-fascist radical nationalist groups gained much more power? It's in the eastern part, not in the west. And that's something that is duplicated on all European level because the fascist parties of Western Europe, think of the Le Pen father and Le Pen daughter, think of Fini in Italy, think about even the remnants of Francoism. They have become populists. That's one of the origins of populism. But this has not occurred in the same way in the East. And I think in that sense, you can see a party like Jobbik gain a lot of strength. Now, the fact that Jobbik now has moved to the, if you want, the center from Fidesz is because Fidesz has become so right-wing itself. But at least the possibility of Jobbik existed in Poland, in Hungary, probably Bulgaria, and even ex-Yugoslavia. Versions of this are possible. So I think that that you have to take into account the fact that communism, in a way, delayed or even replaced the overcoming of that fascist heritage along with its taboos, maybe not including anti-Semitism. Maybe that cannot be recovered, but other dimensions of fascism can be, and we should be afraid of it.
Okay. Thank you very much for everyone. I told you that I will answer Andrew's question at the end, but I have two answers, a long one, which I won't share because I will talk about this in 2 weeks lecture. So in my lecture on the 5th of February, I will try to share my view on this question, what is the reason and prospect of populism in Hungary and the regime in Hungary. And also I have another short answer that I think most of the lectures coming this semester will help us to understand how these types of regimes develop and where is the threshold between authoritarianism and a non-authoritarian populist regime or government or attempts to transform a regime. So I think I'm sure that we passed the official end of the lecture. So thank you for remaining with us until now. And next week we will have Pierre Rosenwald as a guest lecturer, guest speaker. So we welcome you the next lecture as well. If you want to be notified personally and you're not on the list yet, please don't forget to give your address in the chat right now that Udita can notify you directly about the next lectures. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.